In this lesson, I want to talk to you about moving on from what you've done about social inequality and talk to you about how this pattern that we can see in some areas of the UK and around the world relates to some of the changes that we've seen in globalisation and the changing global connections and the impact they're having that is both positive and negative. Looking at this map of the UK in terms of gross disposable household income, I can see a clear pattern. If I draw a line here, I see everything below the line is in the richest 40% in the country. So the south of England is, in terms of disposable household income, very rich. Above the line in the north of England, there is a slightly different pattern. So in the Tyne and Wear region and in Lancashire, Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire, but also in South Wales, we see that there is quite a few areas of the poorest 40%. And there is a reason why that has happened, and that is very much related to changes in the economic global system that have had impacted on places. And that's the really important reason that we need to discuss how these changes have had impacts on the places that we see. So the big question to answer is what happened? We can see by looking at this graph on the left that major industries, the steel industry was a really big industry in the UK. So in the 60s, it would have been one of the biggest steel producers in the entire world. Huge number losses. And this was largely because of something called the New International Division of Labour. And this is basically where TNCs are able to uproot the manufacturing and move it into newly industrialized countries. So we see the shifting of big heavy industries like steel, like manufacturing, like shipbuilding to Southeast Asia, and particularly places like China. Some even, kind of getting coal from places like West Africa, like Nigeria, South Africa. So essentially what we're getting is it's much, much cheaper to produce goods in these countries, lower labour costs, and so factories were being moved out there, and therefore we are seeing the huge losses of these industries, huge unemployment rates in places. For example, with steel would be Sheffield, a place where the entire city would have functioned around steel and similar related industries like coal mining, and with the loss of these major industries in the kind of late 70s, early 80s, we see huge unemployment and the knock-on demultiplier effects that are caused by that. Meanwhile, in these countries, these LIDC countries in Southeast Asia, Malaysia and China, South Korea, we see huge opportunities, new jobs being produced, TNCs making large profits in these countries. And so while there's losses for workers and areas and places in AC countries, we see opportunities being created in LIDCs, EDCs. So we get the kind of scenario now where places like China are the largest manufacturing countries in the world. We still have AC countries in there, but you can see we have Mexico, we have India, we have China, all in the kind of top 10 countries where in the 60s and 70s it would have been the UK, Germany, Japan and the United States. One of the reasons why we're able to have these giant shifts is because of technological changes. So containerization, where it's much easier to be able to move goods in huge bulk shipping, means that this technological change means that we can have our manufacturing where labour costs are low and then ship them to other markets. The rise of communications like the internet have enabled us to have factories remotely that we can organise from other parts of the world, which means we can take advantage of the lower costs in other parts of the world. Now we need to look into greater depth on how these changes in global patterns, economic change, actually affected places. So if we look at this map of the UK, we can see that the loss of industrial employment for some areas was incredibly high. So this area that we've already talked about, I talked about Sheffield, but again, Tyne and Wear and also Merseyside and the south of Wales, all of these industrial strongholds of the industrial period in the 1950s had huge industrial losses, lots of those manufacturing jobs moving to other countries. So these areas would have been disproportionately affected, even though we can see other areas are affected, these areas would have been affected the most. And so when we come to looking at scale, we can look and say that certain places would have been relatively worse off and more affected than other areas. Some areas would have been less resilient to this, depending on how many industries they had. And some places would have had a very narrow range of industries, of coal mining and shipbuilding and manufacturing. And so therefore, when they lost those industries, they would have been really, really badly affected. Also, we have this thing that I've kind of mentioned already called the demultiplier effect. So this is where we get an area that loses jobs. Because of that, the loss of jobs, people have less disposable income. If they have less disposable income, that means things like the local services kind of have to close down, which means that you get further job losses, which then, as of that, you can get other social impacts of that. So you get crime rates rising. But also, because you've got lots of jobs in this area, so you get house prices go down. So in the same way that you can get, when money is invested to an area, you get lots of positive effects, you can get this demultiplier effect, where it's a knock-on from one movement to the other, where one bad thing leads to more bad things. And that's why we get these areas where there is, despite 20 or 30 years going past, there are still a huge gap in the inequality of those areas, where those northern regions, especially in the UK, will have been a lot worse off. In terms of impacts on places directly, if you see on this right picture, this is a picture of Sheffield's old steel manufacturing. You get the environment, the physical environment. You get lots of abandoned buildings. You get lots of kind of old canalways that are kind of in disrepair, and therefore you get pollution in those. And in terms of not just the actual places, you get an impact on the people. I've talked about the Fort Monty, and that's a really good example of, it's set in Sheffield, and these were steel workers. And despite the loss of these jobs, they couldn't find any other jobs because the skills were not transferable. So even when we look about the impact of places, some people are affected more than others. And if we're looking in terms of not just people in the north of England compared to the south, but the fact is that a lot of the people that would have lost these jobs would have been, men. And in terms of, they would have less transferable skills in terms of when the UK started to switch to a tertiary economy, so they would have less skills, so soft skills and being able to sell things in shops or be able to talk in call centres, things that they would not have had the education or skill set having worked in manufacturing. So we can therefore break down saying the impact of people, not just in terms of where in the country, what type of areas, but also the type of people that get affected in these consequences. As I've just mentioned, obviously we've had lots of negatives for ACs. So ACs would have lots of negative areas, but not everywhere. But then LIDCs would have had lots of positives. So there is both opportunity and challenges when it comes to economic change and how it affects places.